Check out this building. Who lives in a place like that? Was it a stately home? Did lords and ladies entertain here? Was it a grand hotel? What was it?
In 1885, this building opened its doors to the public. There was an ornately decorated dining hall, stunning suites with space for live-in maids, and lush grounds to wander through. But it was a particular kind of person who stayed here. And it wasn't the ultra-wealthy of Victorian society. The 19th century saw an increase in psychiatric hospitals across Britain to treat mental illness. Prior to the Lunacy Act of 1845, the mentally ill were often criminalised and imprisoned, but afterwards, mad people were considered ill and could recover with treatment. Generally known as lunatic asylums, their compassionate vision often gave way to a dark reality. Places like Bethlehem Hospital, or commonly known as Bedlam, were notorious for abusing patients, as mental conditions were misunderstood, and treatments included literally trying to beat sense into people.
It wasn't just people who were mentally unwell or couldn't care for themselves that ended up in asylums. People who strayed from society's strict moral code, like having a baby out of wedlock, could also find themselves interned. Holloway Sanatorium stood apart from other asylums at the time because of its patients. The wealthiest members of society could afford private care, but the middle classes who couldn't afford the very best but wanted to avoid the degrading zoo-like treatment that the poor suffered had few options. So this was for them. The sanatorium was an asylum in the original sense of the word, not an institute to lock away the insane, but a sanctuary or shelter for those in need.
At the Sani, as it was affectionately known, there were tennis courts, a swimming pool, art classes, concerts and prize draws in the Great Hall. This was the very early days of occupational therapy.
In some respects, the sanatorium was like a spa, even offering massage and dance therapy, and some of the patients stayed voluntarily.
This is Joy. She was a nurse here from...
I started in '54 and I finished in 1962. Most people's idea when they first come in is, wasn't this oppressive for the patients? I don't think that they would have noticed it. By very virtue of being mentally ill, they were very self-centered, thinking of themselves and not particularly where they were.
Some thought the plain, austere walls of typical asylums was enough to make anyone go insane, and so the sanatorium was created as a richly decorated Gothic hospital. All the animals on the wallpaper look thoroughly miserable, but I have managed to find a happy lion. Detailed casebooks give a remarkable insight into the types of patients who came here. This annual report from 1901 breaks down the causes of insanity into two broad categories. Moral insanity, which includes domestic trouble relating to loss of relatives and friends. Adverse circumstances, which include business anxiety. Then there's mental anxiety, worry, overwork, religious excitement, fright, and nervous shock. The other cause of insanity is physical, and that includes intemperance in drink, venereal disease, self-abuse, in brackets, sexual, sunstroke, accident or injury, lactation is one, fevers, old age is listed as a cause of insanity, and other bodily diseases or disorders. One of the first patients admitted to the sanatorium on August 4th, 1885 was a 46-year-old woman named Jane Ashford. According to this, she had trouble and anxiety from the loss of several near relatives. She was suicidal, dangerous to others, and had an abstracted, melancholy look. The doctor says she was raving about having committed a great sin. She inflicted 2 wounds on herself with a penknife, one under her left breast and the other at the back of her head.
There was a patient on Thomas Holloway, and she had been admitted in the very early days, probably round about 17, as a moral defective. She had had a baby, she wasn't married, so she was quietly sent away to have the baby. The baby was taken away, she never saw it, and she was admitted here. I think mostly because she was an embarrassment to her family. We are talking about the period before and during the First World War. The stigma attached to mental illness, which still occurs now, was possibly for the middle classes and the upper middle classes even more embarrassing, because they didn't want to be tarred with the same idea that one of their relations was insane. And she stayed, she became institutionalized, and she stayed until the end of her days here, and she died here. To all intents and purposes, she seemed happy. She looked upon this as her home, the staff as her friends.
Moral treatment became one of the fundamental approaches to mental health treatment in the 19th century. Grounded in religious doctrine, doctors and carers took a strict paternal approach.
The idea was a patient had a better chance of recovery if treated like a child and taught the consequences of their actions. Patients would be expected to complete chores, and rules were enforced with rewards and punishments. Sanity was to be restored through self-discipline.
There's considerable doubt over how effective this type of treatment was. Critics argue that moral treatment made patients more dependent on doctors and institutions, replacing the physical chains of asylums like Bedlam with invisible ones that were much harder to escape. While the sanatorium was originally intended for people with minor conditions like hysteria or nerves, over time the severity of the illnesses at the asylum got much worse. More violent patients were locked in their own ward and could be restrained in padded cells. And for patients that didn't respond to any treatments, there was an operating theatre. Terms like madness, lunacy, and insanity were accepted medical labels even into the early 1900s. However, as time went on, names for illnesses changed, and what was considered mental illness or moral degeneracy also changed. Patient confidentiality got stricter too, and the amount of personal detail in the annual reports became less and less. You can see this just from the thickness of these reports. Mental health treatment has come a long way from physical restraints and frontal lobotomies, but the line between mentally well and unwell is still difficult to determine. During its 95 years of operation, the types of treatments offered by Holloway Sanatorium reflect constantly evolving approaches to mental health care, as well as the public's openness to what constitutes mental wellness.